Hi everyone and welcome to today's kitchen session. Is spirituality good for society? Today's kitchen session will be delivered by Dr. Wendy Dossett, Associate Professor for Religious Studies. My name's Abby and I'm a Higher Education Advisor here at the University of Chester. I'm also here along with my colleagues Mark and Alex, who are both helping out behind the scenes today. So I will start by reassuring you that your video and audio will not be shared at all during the session. I will shortly be handing over to Wendy, but I just want to go through a couple of things with you before I do. So during the presentation, you will be able to ask questions in the chat function, which is on the right hand side of the screen. You can ask your questions anonymously if you wish. So in order to do that, you'll just need to tick the box to say that you wish to be anonymous. You can also like other questions that other people have posted, and you can also answer any questions that Wendy might ask during her presentation by responding in the chat function. So Mark will then ask Wendy all of your questions at the end of the session. So I think that's everything. So over to you, Wendy.
Thank you, Abby. Hi, everybody. My name's Wendy, and I'm really pleased to be with you this afternoon. I'm going to ask the question, is spirituality good for society? I just need to move my PowerPoint. Do make sure that you heard the question right. It's not, is spirituality true? It's, is spirituality good for society? You might expect someone like me who works in religious studies to be all for it. If so, you might also think that I'm going to come across as a bit of a killjoy when I raise the issues that I'm going to raise. However, questioning taken for granted things is one of the most important skills that we learn at university, and it's definitely something we value and teach you how to do in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Chester. Questioning taken for granted things is what I'm going to do in this talk, and the students pictured here love doing it too. My reason for picking this question is that it's one that is not often asked, and I want to begin by considering why we don't ask this question more often. I think it's because there's a dominant taken for granted narrative that spirituality is an all-round good thing. That narrative goes like this. Spirituality is way better than religion, because let's face it, religion, more often than not, carries a cargo of different kinds of hatred, like racism, sexism, and homophobia. Religion is implicated in all sorts of atrocities, like empires, genocides, and other abuses and oppressions. Secularism, on the other hand, is just boring, grey, and soulless, and doesn't help much with the big questions of life. Spirituality, though, takes some of the good elements of religion and ditches all that other stuff that we don't want. It's less demanding about specific creeds and commandments, doesn't boss you about. It's much more about inner feelings and experiences, perhaps habits and practices, a sense of wonder and connection, and a sense of personal well-being. What's not to like? Perhaps you agree with me that this is a widespread view, but I hope that at least some of you are saying, whoa, hang on a minute, that's a rather one-sided presentation of religion. Some forms of religion are anti-racist, anti-sexist, and anti-homophobic. They are far more liberatory than my picture allows. And you might also be thinking, hang on a minute, don't religions also talk about inner feelings, experiences, habits and practices, a sense of wonder and connection, and a sense of well-being? If so, good. I hope you have similar doubts about that less than well-informed picture of secularism too. These questions and doubts should make us sceptical about how fit for purpose the categories of religion and spirituality are. But to be honest, that's a topic for another talk. While we must bear these questions and doubts in mind, it should also be said that sociologists who track the ways people talk about their values and worldviews in the parts of the world where English language dominates have noticed a general trend, what they call, using Charles Taylor's phrase, the subjective turn. A turn away from passively accepting the packaged certainty of an institutional religion towards what might seem like more individual choice, a what's right for me kind of approach. And spirituality, being such an elastic term, can include all sorts of different practices and lifestyles that people think are right for them. Freedom of choice and not judging people for their choices. That's all good, right? So what's my problem? Why am I saying we shouldn't jump to the conclusion that spirituality is good for society? I want to start with the theme of feeling better, but I need to be very careful here because I don't want to leave you with the idea that self-care is not important. Audre Lorde's statement that self-care is an act of political warfare rings true to me. Here we are in the middle of a global pandemic, a financial and mental health crisis, the like of which has never been seen, spiralling levels of grief, loneliness and distress. Sociologists have shown that Westerners in even greater numbers are turning to spirituality for much needed comfort. They may be looking for practices like mindfulness or yoga, for relaxation or living in the moment, or for dealing with the very serious issues of coping with the triggers of addiction or managing anger or anxiety. This is all surely good for society. I've personally never seen any evidence that makes me doubt the well-known saying, you must care for yourself before you can care for others. And self-care is really hard. And of course, spirituality can help. But here comes the killjoy perspective. We've already mentioned how spirituality and religion overlap, but spirituality also overlaps with what is increasingly being described as the wellness industry. The problem with the wellness industry is that it has elements that paradoxically undermine the well-being that it purports to foster. It's an industry, so it sells things. Nothing surprising about that, perhaps, but what is it selling? Here I'm indebted to the yoga scholar, Dr. Theo Wildcroft, who shows that what so often is being sold is the image of the perfect yoga body. Always white, able-bodied, athletic build, wearing the right brands, having the right props, and consuming all the right supplements and expensive products. The dominance of this image is damaging to the well-being of anyone for whom those images are impossible aspirations, i.e. the vast majority of us. Wildcroft points out to us various examples in the yoga world which disrupt that powerful picture, but it's hard to deny that it's dominant and it's toxic. And I'm not done with feeling better yet either. Feeling better is important, but if the focus stays on that and that alone, then yes, it lines up well with the idea of the subjective turn, that we as individuals are the best judge of what's best for us, but that so easily becomes self-serving. There's a strange narrative that puts personal happiness at the top of people's aspirations. In the last couple of decades, we've seen the rise of the happiness industry, as if happiness is the goal of life or an inalienable human right. We might think it's a better aspiration than that for wealth or power, but it has some of the same features. If all we are doing is individually seeking our own happiness, pausing every now and then to do some yoga or meditation to keep us going in that utterly exhausting endeavour, we leave all of the structures of injustice which cause suffering to ourselves and others firmly in place. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek famously said that the interest in Asian spirituality in the West actually functioned as a neoliberal supplement. This means spirituality is all about keeping us calm and comforted enough to enable us to keep going on the big project of increasing our own individual prosperity and happiness. In other words, spirituality is keeping capitalism going. One thing worth noting about Žižek is that he shows very little knowledge about the forms of spirituality he criticises, and in my humble opinion, he would have benefited greatly from a degree in religious studies. But that aside, he certainly presents the proponents of the case that spirituality is good for society with a profound challenge. Here I'm using a political critique of spirituality, and I want to develop that a bit with an economic focus. It goes like this. We might also notice how rich some spiritual teachers are, how they've monetized their ideas, or ideas they've picked up from elsewhere, often actually from religions. Or perhaps they're not so much monetizing their ideas, but monetizing the suffering that leads their followers to them desperately looking for answers. This is an argument made by, among others, Barbara Ehrenreich. Ehrenreich's book, Bright-Sided, also outlines the problem with what is called magical thinking, a phenomenon she identifies as running through a great deal of contemporary spirituality. At its most extreme, this is the kind which claims we have the power to manifest what we want, such as is presented in the popular book and spiritual tradition of Rhonda Byrne's The Secret. If those things we want don't come to us, then the failure is with us. We didn't think positively enough. It's easy to see how this is a potentially damaging train of thought. What about people who fall terminally ill? Is their situation a failure to think positively? The current pandemic has clearly shown how this kind of spirituality is not just unthinking, it's positively dangerous for public health. If you think your spiritual practices will protect you, you don't need to socially distance or wear a mask. But if you don't socially distance or wear a mask, if you're able to, then you're putting others at serious risk. So to conclude, I've argued that we shouldn't simply take it for granted that spirituality is a good thing for society. It's not as simple as that. You might have noticed that I haven't given space here for voices from spiritual traditions, nor to counter arguments. And if we were to take this discussion further, like we would in a class at university, we would certainly do that. There's a great deal more to say, but I hope that's given you a picture of the kinds of discussions you might expect if you were to study with us in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of Chester. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thanks Wendy for that. So we have a couple of questions come through now.
Great.
So the sense of interconnection into being seems to be at the heart of those world religions. I know a bit about these, and at the heart of spiritual practice and working for justice of all kinds is the natural outflow of the sense of interconnectedness. But does it matter what labels we use?
Ooh, so I heard there somebody who knows a bit about Buddhism perhaps talking about interconnectedness and interbeing. Interbeing is a term used by the Vietnamese Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, and the idea of connectedness is one that is widespread within various spiritual traditions, and it's an interesting one. I think the question there, Mark, was, does it matter what label we give it? Now, that's interesting. I suppose I would observe different spiritual traditions and see how they borrow from each other. That's something as an academic that I'm quite interested in doing, and you know, ideas circulate across different spiritual traditions, and they are given different labels. I'd love to know more from the questioner, what was behind that question. But for sure, you get lots of ideas that crop up, that appear in different traditions. They're given different terms, sometimes different names, but you do find them in lots of different places.
Okay, thanks for that. So the next question is more probably focused for the overall subject talk, really, is, you know, around, this person's asked, do you think this is a uniquely Western problem, as in, is spirituality good for society, but just for, I'm guessing they're thinking that it's just focusing on the West itself, rather than looking further afield. You know, what are your views on that?
That is a great question. So my talk focused on kind of the phenomenon of spirituality in the West. So there's a kind of idea that people are identifying more frequently as spiritual but not religious. So sociologists call that SBNR, spiritual but not religious. It's largely a Western phenomenon, and it's against the backdrop of secularization that we have in the West. So the decline of the power of institutional religion within our societies, and of course that's a situation that is not reflected in other places in the world. So the context that I'm talking about is a Western context. So whoever asked that question, that's a great question to ask. It's always a good one. You know, what does this question look like in other places in the world? And it wouldn't be asked in the same way.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for that, Wendy. And one last question then, left then for the kitchen session for this week is, are you saying people shouldn't try to be happy?
No, I'm not saying people shouldn't try to be happy, and I'm going to have to be careful here not to end up, you know, kind of putting myself in the position of being a guru or a religious teacher. I'm not. I'm an academic in religious studies, so I don't tell people how to live their lives. But what I'm doing is questioning the consequences when people's aspiration for themselves is their own personal happiness. So I'm saying that there's evidence really that is a kind of problematic aspiration, because it actually causes a great deal more misery than it does happiness, and it doesn't address the structural problems in society. So we have to ask, why are we unhappy? And we are unhappy because of the structures of various forms of oppression many of which are associated with capitalism, but with racism and sexism and homophobia and all of those things. And our happiness might rest better on trying to dismantle those structures rather than trying to carve out little individual areas of happiness for ourselves.
That's great. We literally just this second had another question just come through, so I believe this would probably be the final one now. So you mentioned different traditions borrowing from each other. Mm-hmm. Could there be universal truths which are experienced through the lens of time and place?
Oh, that's a philosopher who's asked that question. Fantastic. So as an academic in religious studies, my approach is not to ask, is this true or not? It's to bracket out those questions of truth. So my colleagues who are philosophers would be asking the truth questions. But I think it's very interesting that ideas do crop up over and over again in the human experience, and it does lend itself to the possibility that that it's, you know, these ideas are hooking into some ontological or metaphysical reality. But as an academic in religious studies, I personally stay agnostic about that. I'm interested to observe it and to track it, but not to kind of make claims of truth or falsity.
Okay, so I think that's all the questions for today. Over to you now, Abby.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much for that. So that is it today for today's kitchen session. So thank you to everybody that joined us, and thank you so much to Wendy as well for such an interesting presentation. We hope everybody enjoyed the session, and we really hope that you found it useful. So we are going to be running more kitchen sessions, so do check the schedule and sign up for any others that you might be interested in. So thank you very much.